So, thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transportation. And today we are going to discuss something about governance in general, which is technically in the news. And what I mean by technically in the news, there's something called Chevron deference, which, if you see what I just Googled, as of yesterday, no longer exists. So, why are you asking me to review this? 40 years ago, there was a ruling called, Chevron, where the Supreme Court said that on matters of how to interpret statutes, the courts should be deferring to executive agencies. So on how to interpret environmental law, for example, the courts have to defer to the expertise, in this case the EPA, on railroad matters, the FRA, and so on, and not question their judgment of facts. And that just got repealed because conservatives think that the administrative state is a form of tyranny. And now people are saying, well, what's going to happen to the administrative state in America? Well, it's a ruling from 40 years ago, and the United States did have somewhat of an administrative state more than 40 years ago. If anything, it was clawed back in the 80s. In the 70s and 80s, it was being clawed back with adversarial legalism. Or more, and then you go farther back and go to the 50s and 60s, and you can see kind of the genesis of maybe an administrative state. It just never amounted to much. And instead, the United States adopted a mode in, starting I think mostly in the 70s, called adversarial legalism, which contrasts with the norm in, I'm going to say non-English speaking first world democracies, but the United Kingdom was to a large extent like that as well, and then it Americanized over time, which is bureaucratic legalism. So, instead of defining them, I'm going to give you concrete examples of what this means. So, in the United States, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, I believe 1990, which establishes certain rules of non-discrimination against disabled people, and in what's relevant to us, which is public infrastructure, it requires that everything be made accessible. The main cost item is installing elevators at subway stations, and maybe getting buses that are more wheelchair accessible, which means, for example, low floor buses. That said, low floor buses have a lot of benefits for people who are not disabled. Now, I've blogged and I've vlogged before about models of accessibility and universal design. I will point out that whatever the model is, the hardest thing, and often the thing that is least useful for able-bodied people, is elevators at subway stations. If you have luggage, then escalators are good enough. So, and retrofitting this is actually hard. It costs millions of dollars in a normal country per station. In a non-normal country like the United States, make it tens of millions of dollars. Now, I bring this up. Now, so why do I bring this up? So, okay, there's a rule about accessibility. There are some engineering standards involved, like, for example, a slope in America is considered to be wheelchair accessible if the rule is that it needs to be maximum 1 in 12, and every 12 horizontal, 1 vertical, 12 horizontal feet, 1 vertical foot, there needs to be a 1 foot refuge, so flat, which means that over a long stretch it needs to be at most 1 in 13. So it's standards like that. And then if you're wondering how this standard compares with European standards, the answer is not materially different. They're defined differently in, for example, Spain or Norway, but it's fundamentally roughly that. And for example, the standards might tighten over time. Norway used to have a 1 in 10 standard, and it's now 1 in 20. Stephen with a PH. Yeah, ramps are not good as the only, if it's the only way to get somewhere. And if it's a long ramp, uh, usually you want ramp and stairs, depending on how deep if it's a deep station, it's going to be probably stairs, escalator, and elevator. You probably need all three. You can't do escalator and elevator only, for a bunch of reasons I don't want to get into. But anyway, my point is that the ADA, forget the engineering standards for a moment, the ADA is enforced adversarially. Someone needs to sue. It's assumed that there needs to be a constant adversarial process. It emerges out of a mentality that I think comes from civil rights activists who would constantly say things like, you are constantly fighting with and negotiating with people in power. Your choice in the election is which person you want to be the counterparty. So the idea in this case is that the government is never going to be composed of civil rights advocates who then use the power of the state to advance civil rights. Now, this is what in practice happened. The state, in this case the United States, passed civil rights laws in the 1960s that mandated civil rights due to these representatives and senators exercising the public will. Civil rights were very popular in the 50s and the first half of the 60s in the United States. It didn't happen earlier because of Senate filibusters. But both when Congress was reducing the autonomy of southern states and when the courts had very civil rights and democratic representation oriented rulings, they were enacting the will of the majority of the American public, is what a lot of people in the United States have conveniently forgotten. So anyway, there's this counterparty mentality. So in this way, you need to constantly fight the government, and then lawfare is a way of maybe taming that a little bit, but still keeping the fight. So in this idea, if you want accessibility, you must sue. In this idea, a proper activist is someone who constantly sues the state. For years, before I started doing what I'm doing professionally, Stephen told me, can you not just sue someone so that I can refer to you as an activist in the media? And I'm all, wait, why am I supposed to sue? Also, I live in Canada/Sweden. Why would I be suing people in the United States? And so their entire questions regarding anything about how the government does in this mentality, in this adversarial mentality, hinge on completely irrelevant legal questions, or normally irrelevant legal questions of standing. For example, who has standing to sue on matters of congestion pricing or something like that? And with congestion pricing, the governor was violating the law. And even then, they need to find someone who is a possible plaintiff instead of having a public agency read the fucking law and say, no, the state legislature said that, this will happen. And Americans constantly believe that this is how civil rights work, because they believe that there are no civil rights outside the United States. I've heard Americans say multiple times, oh, other countries don't have the ADA. No shit, they don't have the ADA. They don't have the Americans with Disabilities Act. They have other disability laws, which, again, you look in practice, New York is 30% accessible. Berlin has a subway system of about the same age as New York City and way worse resourced than the MTA. It's in the 80s, I think 84%, 85% accessible at this point. It was supposed to be completed 2 years ago. It's being delayed. It will be done in a couple of years. I don't think so this is an American thing. The Anglo world, the rest of the Anglo world is different. It's not survival of the fittest, but with ideas. I actually don't think it's like that at all. So there is a mentality which is survival of the fittest with ideas. The person that I probably think of first these days when you mention this is Friedrich Merz. Merz has a lot of cope about why he kept losing CDU primaries. He hates Merkel. He doesn't think Merkel was fit to govern. It's one of the cliques that called her Mutti, to like say, oh, she's so motherly. Mothers stay at home and tend to the children. Governance is for men. It's kind of that mentality. So he says that it's not good for democracy if there's too much consensus. It's better if, for example, center-right media lies about what SPD and the Greens are doing, or and encourages physical violence by extreme right people against the Greens, and offer the weakest possible condemnation of extreme right violence. So this is survival of the fittest with ideas. It's a kind of no compromises, no consensus, just this is a guy who probably wishes he were Orban, like that kind of polarization. No, of course, I'm not saying survival of the fittest. It's define fittest in this case. I would say, but I mean, if a lot of elites agree with it, then that's one way to define fittest. But anyway, that's something political, and it's different from the legal system. So anyway, so this is, again, it's an America special, the legal system that expects you to sue about anything, or let's say wage theft. In normal countries, if your employer doesn't pay you the wages that you're legally entitled to by contract, you complain to a government agency, which will fine the employer with such a large margin that the employer will not even try. Israel, for example, has rather high inequality. Less than the United States, of course, but more than, I think, possibly more than any Western European country. I'm not sure. It depends on the country. It depends on the year, or it depends on... No, obviously not depends on the country. Depends on the... depending on which data set you use. There are a couple, and they agree mostly, but there are some exceptions. In Israel, there's basically no wage theft, because there are exact rules specifying exact penalties, and if you don't pay your employees on time, after I think maybe an 8 or 9 day grace period, I believe that you need to pay it with an interest of something like 5% per week. It's like some ridiculously high interest rate that employers will never even try to trigger. So that's the result, because that's bureaucratic. And in the United States, there need to be various kinds of lawsuits on this, and the employer is always going to be stronger than you in court, so it needs to be class action if you want to win. But for this to be class action, you need a big employer. So anything smaller than that, there's just rampant wage theft in the United States as a result, because essentially the state is not there. It's assumed, it's reduced to court action. This has nothing to do with Chevron, by the way. So when people talk about how the administrative state is being abolished, I'm in the United States right now, but I normally am not. I'm from Germany, thinking, wait, what administrative state are we talking about in America? And so the alternative to adversarial legalism is called bureaucratic legalism, and that's where, instead of needing to sue over, let's say, environmental law or disability law or civil rights law, there are government agencies that are tasked with these decisions, and the ability of people to object to them legally is there, but it is much more limited. So Chevron, for example, was one limitation on the ability of people to sue, and the entirely correct reading that the bureaucrats, and for example in this case it was environmental law, actually know the science of this and environmental engineering, and judges know what one slave owner said to another slave owner about like some weird matters of morality that never applied to the slaves. And the slave owner does not even have to be American. They read like some Roman slave owners do. Slave owners know that. And so under bureaucratic legalism, often the judge is just going to be entirely out of the loop. Not, oh, I'm a judge, but I should maybe defer to a government agency if it's something that I agree with politically. No, the ability to object, again, it's there. In Milan, they had to pause congestion pricing for, I think, 8 weeks early on because a judge made up some reason it was unconstitutional or illegal, and then they got it back. Now, but that's not the norm. The norm in Italy is bureaucratic, and not just Italy. This is something that is kind of part of, let's call it the continental Western European / democratic East Asian package, which has a lot of elements which correlate just because of social learning, but they don't need to be there at the same time. So things like interest group corporatism rather than interest group pluralism. Essentially, the parties are strong, so you can never buy an individual legislator the way you do in the United States. So instead, an entire union movement will have its own allies in politics, and entire and federations of employers in different industries will as well. And often decisions, this was more truer in the Cold War than now, decisions on labor versus bosses conflict were done by something called tripartite agreements. Tripartite means the 3 parties were labor, business, and government. This is not purely a European thing. Japan had the same thing. Again, it's mostly that corporatism is mostly gone at this point. But it's still there in non-English speaking democracies more than in the United States. In the United States, it's, first of all, labor is much weaker, but also parties are much weaker. It's just much easier to buy individual legislators. Again, it's one of the things that correlate, but it's not exactly this. But another element, but the more specific bureaucratic legalist element is that decisions on, I wouldn't call it interpretations of statutes, because first of all, if it is in a place that's neither Anglo nor Nordic, the law is written in a much more precise way. The statutory law is much richer in the French and German traditions than in the British, and to a large extent also Nordic one. And but more than that, a lot of specific implementations will be done by executive agencies. In the United States, it's called ministerial approval, which is a really weird term, I think, because the political minister doesn't even read what they're signing at that level. So, for example, environmental protection will be done by an agency or set of agencies that make decisions based on the professionalism, in this case, of let's say people who have studied things like air pollution, conservation biology for endangered species, water pollution, noise. Just a reminder, noise pollution is a kind of pollution. It's not usually treated the same as the others, but it absolutely is pollution. Or for historic protection, you don't sue for a historic district. Why the hell would a judge ever be in the loop? Instead, there's in Italy the Monuments Protection Agency, which may require that certain techniques be used, even if they're more expensive, in order to reduce, ideally eliminate risk to ancient historic monuments. This is why the construction costs in Rome are so dependent on which exact neighborhood you're building in. If it's a place that urbanized in the 19th century, the costs in Rome are the same as in Milano. This is, for example, Metro B1 in Rome. On the other hand, if it is in a much older area, for example, the more recently built parts of Metro C, tranche 3, 4, 5, 6 onward is in the more suburban area. Then the construction costs are very high because they need to use more expensive techniques, because the allowed amount of, for example, building subsidence is very tight in order to eliminate risks to things like the Colosseum or the remains of the Imperial Forum. So this is something that is done entirely bureaucratically. So the decisions were made by archaeologists, by historians, by geologists. They were not made by judges, and I imagine there were lawyers at some point in the room, but they did not take the lead role that they do in the United States. So that's probably the biggest difference between adversarial and bureaucratic legalism. Now, Americans think that bureaucratic legalism means that there's no freedom in the country, on the rule that tyranny means any instantiation of the government that is, or of the state, that is not within tradition. I say not within tradition because American libertarians think that conscription is an affront against freedom. Tellingly, Israeli libertarians who otherwise are extremely Americanized will never say that. Conversely, you tell people outside the US and UK that it's normal to force random individuals to take unpaid time off of work in order to sit on a jury, and they will tell you, what the hell? Again, it's all, I mean, if it's within tradition, it's never called tyranny. I bring this up because we can compare the outcomes of adversarial and bureaucratic legalism, and those of adversarial legalism are just not good. So I gave the example of wage theft, in which a counterparty is not even the state, it's big business. But it cannot be too big of a business, because if it's too big of a business, then there is a class action. I doubt there is wage theft at, for example, Walmart. So I give Walmart as an example just because it's a huge employer. It's all central. It's not a franchise system. So the manager of, let's say, Walmart, of the Walmart store or Walmart supercenter, is someone who, as I understand it, comes from within the Walmart corporate hierarchy rather than someone who bought the franchise. To the point that if there's any risk of unionization at that store, then Central HQ will send their own anti-union consultants to take control a little bit and make sure that there's no unionization. So this is an employer that the labor movement tried to organize, and even tried to organize a boycott of, which was enthusiastically backed by people living in places that did not have Walmart. I don't think I've ever set foot in a Walmart. I've also never had the opportunity to, because where the hell is Walmart in New York? Or Providence, for that matter. The point is that I don't think Walmart can do significant wage theft, because it gets class action. If that happens, they get class action. So it's employers that have more than one employee, probably, but they cannot be too big. So they have much more power over workers if the workers need to sue every time, and if it's an employer with 150 employees and not 1 million employees, then they're never going to even generate enough money for class action. I mean, you steal wages from, let's say, 10 workers by falsifying papers on when they stop working when you fire them. Apparently it's a thing in America when the employer will fire you and then not pay you for the last month by backdating date you are fired. So they're essentially stealing maybe 2 weeks worth of wages from you, which for you might be significant, but for you and the, I don't know, 10 other people they did it to, that's still not enough money and damages to recover, I don't think, in order to entice a lawyer with enough resources to fight the business. And whenever it's done bureaucratically, it's actually working. So, for example, if you do triple damages, which some US states do, I know this about Maryland because they talk to a lawyer there, but I don't know about, but this is one random state, so I cannot tell you whether it's the only state that does it or one of the 10 or something. That is actually very good at eliminating wage theft, because as soon as you don't need to class action or get a private lawyer whenever the government actually enforces its own laws, business obeys. And on civil rights, Americans are constantly under the impression that there's no civil rights advocacy in other countries, except when it sounds American to them. So Americans who have heard of Europe and have heard of the existence of people of color in Europe are generally aware that there's a lot of racism in Europe. They know essentially nothing about the details of it, and they know even less, unfortunately, about anti-racist movements within Europe. So they will not know what, for example, Muslim civil rights advocates in France say or do in order to reduce Islamophobia. Some of it, by the way, is adversarial. For example, the civil rights groups needed to sue successfully, I must say, to get municipalities to stop mandating pork in school. The way it works is the food halls are municipal, even if the schools are supervised at a higher level. And from time to time, a mayor would force children to eat pork and then not let them bring their own food because communal eating is an important value to teach or something. And I think it was Muslim, not Jewish, civil rights groups that ran that lawsuit, and that I think the practice was forced to halt in 17 or 18. And so in this case, this is where we're saying rather adversarial praxis. It's not the only practice, though. And on matters of disabilities, for example, what do lawsuits get you? And the answer is very little, because the agency always has more power than you do. It can always make up plausible sounding reasons. A judge is never going to say, okay, I don't trust you. The subway will cease operations within a week unless you're starting to build elevators. Now, the judge could impose a later deadline in a couple years, but it's not going to be an enforceable deadline. They will just drag their feet and say, what, you're going to tell us to cease operations? We're a quarter of the way through this. And the agencies know this, which is why they string the judges along, and this is how you're getting New York just paying zero attention to accessibility. There's a consent decree on the matter. The MTA is trying to take that as a hostage for congestion pricing, saying that there's a bunch of accessibility projects funded in the 2020 to 24 capital plan that they will need to cease work on if there's no congestion pricing. It's a silly hostage to take because the governor doesn't care. Remember, it's supposed to be adversarial. There's no sense that the government ever by itself cares about accessibility except through judges who are viewed incorrectly as external to the government, in a sense. And so, okay, there's going to be less investment in accessibility. Not even all of the transfer stations are accessible. I think 59th Lex might not be. When I'm in New York, this is what I got. Yeah, 59th Lex, I think it's a top 10 station, it's not accessible. 51 lakhs is accessible with this. Nope. And it gets to the point that maybe so this is something that I don't think is about adversarial versus bureaucratic, but American rule of lawyers also mean that the big decisions are made by people who are not subject matter experts, and think of the subject matter experts as the help, which is where you're getting a lot of people trying to do some weird prioritization because they don't know how to make accessibility investments happen faster and more efficiently, but they can talk about how do you define your priorities. That is something that they're capable of. It was also a big thing during early rollout of corona vaccines in the United States, when there was constant discourse about which groups get vaccinated first. In the UK, it was just done by age, and nobody was talking about how to just increase, or at least not publicly, about how to increase the production rate of vaccines, because that's a technical issue, and technical issues are in this ideology subordinate to what are considered to be big ideas, and the big ideas again achieve nothing. And but again, that's not exactly the same adversarial versus bureaucratic. It's just like the interest group pluralism versus corporatism. It's in practice related, or correlated rather. But anyway, so with accessibility, again, look at the outcomes in New York versus Berlin versus Milano versus Madrid versus Barcelona. Literally the only big subway system that's less accessible than New York is Paris. And it's not because it's especially hard to build in Paris, they just don't care. But also in New York, they just don't care either. So that's the issue with too much adversarialism. It kind of assumes that the government sucks. No shit, the government's going to keep sucking if you don't create any mechanism through which bureaucrats can do things that don't suck and then get rewarded for this. To the contrary, the adversarial process means that a manager at an agency who invests in any of these things proactively might be viewed as a pushover and therefore not get any respect. The respect is by the person who fights hard, and the problem is this means fighting hard against better service. The notion that the agency that even bothered to defend itself in court against an ADA challenge should have its entire senior management fired is anathema. Because again, you're supposed to defend yourself even when what you're trying to say in court is that the passengers don't deserve, in this case, more wheelchair accessible service. And then you can see the results. This also matters to costs, because the same system will not promote people who know what they're doing. It won't promote people who know how to build cheaply. To the contrary, it's kind of a system that puts the person who demands wheelchair accessible service and the person who demands $100 million for the Somerville Community Path in the same spot. That is to say, someone who sues the state. So of course it's going to be a compromise in which you're not going to waste all of the money, you're going to waste some of the money, so costs are not going to be 30x what they should be, they're going to be 7x, 8x, let's say. And you're not going to have zero accessibility either, you're going to have partial accessibility, yeah. It's essentially a system that devalues the expertise of, in this case, I don't even know what to say, like transit planners is probably the best way to say it, but also, again, environmental engineers, conservation biologists, doctors and people in the public health profession who can speak about the impact of air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, archaeologists on matters of monuments, like historic monuments. They're usually buried, and it's not like there's a risk to the Colosseum above ground. It's like that anyone is going to fire rockets at the Colosseum. It's that there might be some underground construction that will destabilize the ground and lead to a building collapse. So it's something that's always underground is a problem. Again, that's the difference between these two mentalities, and again, you can see where better infrastructure is being built. And I will say, the UK is becoming more adversarial on the American model. Unlike America, the UK had bureaucratic legalism post-war, and then it kind of abandoned it. Because of the mentality that part of it is just weakening the civil service and the idea that subject matter experts, in the UK as in the US, the engineer is the help. That is another problem, yes. I didn't talk about this before, but you're right. The other issue is that it's easier for judges to block than to mandate. And this is what I said, the judge is never going to be able to truly mandate accessibility installation. They can dedicate a portion of the budget to accessibility in the future, which was what happened with the New York consent decree. They can impose deadlines, but the deadlines aren't necessarily soft and give the agency a lot of leeway, including crying poverty 10 years from now. The judge will not be able to say, these people are trying to make the system less accessible, I forbid them to ever work in government again in the state. I will say that sometimes in environmental lawsuits it is possible to eliminate existing sources. I remember in 2000 there was this US lawsuit where where there was dangerous there was a dangerous pollutant, I'm forgetting what, maybe water pollution, but it was natural. So they discovered that there was this carcinogenic chemical, which was regulated because it's usually produced industrially, but in that case there was a the naturally occurring source of it at above regulated levels, and I believe the ruling was that it's still carcinogenic. Do proactive engineering to eliminate that from the water supply, but you're right about the status quo bias. But again, it's for other reasons, because the specific remedies are always going to be difficult to mandate, especially by a judge who's not an expert in this field, which a judge is not. Again, if it's an American judge, it's someone who not grew up like as a teen or anything, but like went to law school studying the deep meanings of like some slave owner scratchiti, and so not specifically not any technical field, and so this means that the agency can play games with a judge, and the judge will not be able to recognize this because maybe the judge has some intuition about how to tell that someone is bullshitting or that someone is just outright lying, but it's going to be a very police-style method which relies on intimidation, and you cannot intimidate the state. Same reason why police interrogation techniques essentially rely on intimidation, and if you know not to say anything without your lawyer present, and then your lawyer will tell you not to say anything, it's basically impossible to have a case unless you have a really bad luck. Like, I mean, we're talking left your fingerprints at the crime scene and also the weapon or something like that, and otherwise you will just walk. And now with criminal law, I mean, sure, there are rules about protection of innocent people from conviction, but this is not criminal law, and reliance on the combo of intimidation plus the judge not actually being an expert in the field will not actually be able to compel the government. The government will just drag its feet. It will spend the money on betterments. It will say that, while we're making the station accessible, we're also going to add staircases, right? And the judge is not going to say, fuck you. The ADA is not called the Americans who need more stair access points Act. And so the upshot is that uh, it's just not going to compel doing things. And again, ideologically it's related to, like, I think Reagan was talking about freedom of versus freedom from, and I don't remember in what direction, but the idea is that freedom means the government does fewer things and more things. And again, the UK had a bureaucratic system, but it always was much more uneasy with engineer prestige than the norm on the continent or in rich Asia. And so, I mean, so part of it is that the chief civil servants know nothing. I mean, Sir Humphrey is a caricature by someone who, by writers who are very much Thatcherites, but the contempt, but the old boy network and the contempt for everyone who's not part of the network are real at the top levels of the UK civil service. Plus the generalism and the hostility to actual expertise. And in no, by the way, the Yes Minister is very Thatcherite, but at no point does Sir Humphrey block Hacker from doing things that are ideologically Thatcherite. He blocks things like, he blocks efficiency measures, he blocks an integrated transport plan. That's my favorite episode of Yes Minister, as you might imagine. He defends bribery to a generic oil sheikhdom. He doesn't. It's not like the minister is ever trying to cut welfare payments and Humphrey keeps them. Like, it's not that ideological. Like, even the Thatcherite authors of Yes Minister had some self-introspection to understand that it's not that the civil service is just blocking Maggie and her agenda. And of course, if you are more comfortable with technical expertise, you don't ever have the Sir Humphrey in the loop. You have people who came through the agency and are familiar with its specific, I wouldn't say mission because that's so generic, with its specific techniques, let's say, to implement policy. So that's kind of how bureaucratic legalism actually works. So the UK bureaucratic legalism never was quite as good as continental equivalents, and because of this hostility to experts, instead they moved away from that and toward people who instead learned Parkinson's law and like very generic ways that very generic laws for how a generalist manager can intimidate specialists, essentially. So anyway, that's kind of the distinction, and it's very clear which one works better for infrastructure, both for outcomes and for costs. I will take questions for the next couple of minutes. I think I said I would like this to be a shorter stream. But if people have questions, please shoot. By the way, speaking of this, I don't think adversarial legalism is especially NIMBY. Canada, for example, is not. Germany, which is not especially adversarial, is very NIMBY. It's much more political than judicial. In Germany, I don't think you can actually sue and get a judge to block home building. There's just not going to be home building. What does the path look like? Stop making political appointments. Stop putting people like Jana Lieber and Jamie Torres Springer in charge of anything. The expression in DC is Senior Executive Service, SES. This is for people who are civil servants, but are senior enough that they need to be treated as senior management and not as line workers with protections from being fired. So the norm should be you don't do political appointments beyond the level of maybe the single chief of staff to each minister. You elevate people. If you want to hire from outside, you hire from a similar position outside. So maybe you hire a transit manager who was a transit manager in a different city, transit being a field in which the US is extremely weak, you should hire outside the country. This is how Byford got to America. If the governor has discretion or if the president has discretion, it doesn't matter. Just hire professional. Like, you want to eliminate this kind of class system where the bureaucrats need to constantly lower their gaze next to a political appointee, and also are assumed to be terrible and will be promoted even if they, for example, again, defend the agency against civil rights cases. Like, you're not supposed, like, the other thing is also stop defending the agency on this. And start creating norms where defending the agency on this means that you're probably racist or ableist. Bear in mind, they have discretion. They do it anyway. Remember, Tish James, if the lawsuit against Hochul and congestion pricing gets ahead, Tish James, as the Attorney General, has discretion on whether she wants to defend the governor on this. She can say, no, I don't. I believe the lawsuit has merit, and then the governor will have to get private counsel. Like, be better about saying, no, I'm not defending this. The other thing is you can also just start repealing things that are enforced by lawsuit. Like, a lot of the NEPA clawbacks are like this, and they're good. Sure, thanks for asking. And thanks for watching. Are there other questions? How the hell is this 30 seconds of lag? It's supposed to be good internet, man. It's usually 10. Okay, so if there are no final questions, if there are no further questions, sorry about the no further questions, legal speak, it was not intended, I promise. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you once again in a week when I'm going to be back in Germany. Thank you for watching, and ciao ciao.